You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 68. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, but if you would like to support the podcast and the kinds of things that I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET Core. We're currently on a road trip that's winding down, where we cover 25 cities in North America and Europe. We've still got interviews with some of your favorite developers like David Giard and Juliak, as well as other interviews that we've already released, like Scott Guthrie and upcoming the Miguel de Icaza interview. See hwroadtrip.com for more information on cities and dates. I might be in your town soon. Today's guest is G. Andrew Duthie. Andrew, also known as Devhammer, is the founder and chief consultant for Devhammer Enterprises. Andrew is a consultant focused on helping clients meet their business goals through software. Andrew is also a trainer and writer with more than 15 years of industry experience, including nearly 10 years as a technical evangelist for Microsoft's Mid-Atlantic States District, where he provided support and education for developers working with the Microsoft Development Platform. In addition to his work with Microsoft, Andrew is the author of several books on ASP.NET and web development and has spoken at numerous industry conferences from VSLive and ASP.NET Connections to Microsoft Professional Developers Conference, also known as PDC, and TechEd. Andrew has been participating in the user group community since way back in 1997 when one of his co-workers dragged him out to the Internet Developer User Group in Tyson Corner, Virginia, and he's been hooked ever since. Andrew is also the creator and developer of Community Megaphone, a site designed for promoting and finding developer community events. On today's show, Andrew talks about his start not in computers, but in theater. If you've ever seen Andrew speak, that should come as no surprise. He's always been energetic and exciting every time I've heard him speak or even lead a user group. He finally does get down and talk about that first computer, first job, and first language in our talk today. He provides an interesting perspective when software development wasn't your first choice or your first love. Let's take a listen. Welcome, Washington. That's awesome. I'm really glad to be here. We just flew in from actually Barcelona, Spain, me and my wife. And we're here to talk to Andrew Duthie.
Hey.
Am I supposed to say G before that every time?
You don't have to say G every time.
Okay. This is G. Andrew. I never know what to do when there's an initial. But as you know, this podcast is all about how you got started, and so I'm really curious. A lot of the stories we've gotten, people had a computer growing up. Was that your case?
So I did not initially have a computer growing up. I actually started coding at around, I think it was probably right around 10 years old.
Wow.
On a Commodore PET.
Wow, you had a PET.
Yeah,
that was a big
Commodore
box,
Well,
right?
I didn't have one. We actually had one at my school.
Oh, wow.
And one day they actually, I went to a school for sort of G&T kids. And
what are G&T kids? I don't know what that means.
Talented.
Oh, okay, cool.
It was a non-traditional school, no classrooms. It was kind of different areas where you could do art one day, you could do carpentry another day, you could build with blocks, and then basically we would do a planning session in the morning. It was kind of like Scrum before there was Scrum.
Right.
We would do a morning stand-up meeting. So we would do a morning stand-up meeting wasn't really a stand-up, but we would sort of sit down in a circle and we'd talk about, well, what are we going to do today? And then you would do what you were going to do, and then you would do something at the end of the day. How was it different from what I planned to do? So that was kind of, I guess that got me ready to do Agile and Scrum and all that good stuff.
That would have. Yeah. And you were 10 when you went into the school?
In that range. But they had both a Commodore PET in the school, and they also had you remember the teletype machines where you'd plug in an audio coupler and then you'd actually communicate with the mainframe and it would just print out on paper.
There was no screen, right?
Yeah, so we would do Oregon Trail for hours on end, and heaven knows how many trees we killed playing Oregon Trail back in the day on printout paper.
So it would print out, you have died from dysentery.
Exactly. Many times did I die from dysentery or starve to death, or all the various ways, creative ways you could die in Oregon Trail.
Oregon Trail is the only reason I know what that word means, dysentery.
Dysentery.
I had to go look it up.
Very good. But the school offered a program where you could actually take the Commodore PET home for a week and use it at home. And so I told my mom, well, I'm going to bring a pet home from school. Is that okay? And of course she's thinking animal, right? And I bring home this, we go and we pick up this computer, and that's not what I thought. And so for those of you who are a little younger than I am, back in the day with the Commodore PET or the Commodore 64 or the Atari 400, 800, when you powered those machines on, you were at essentially BASIC. It loaded BASIC out of the box. And so to program the Commodore PET, you would enter 10 print hello world. Right? You could write a program in one line of code. It's very, very easy. But there was no internet, right? There were no plural site videos. There were no tutorials like that. What we had was magazines. And so you would get a magazine or a book. You'd get a book out of the library, or you'd buy a computer magazine, and you would painstakingly enter every line of code that you wanted to run this program that was in a magazine.
And did you have, I grew up in Florida, and all I was ever afraid of was a lightning strike that would power down the house for a second. Those brownouts would make the machine go down, and then it was gone.
Right. Well, exactly, because unless you had one of the cassette decks, that's actually how you would save and load programs on a Commodore PET from a cassette deck. It was crazy. But other than that, everything was just in memory. And if you hadn't saved it, it's gone after all of that typing in. But the very first program that I wrote was actually an ASCII rocket launcher. So it would actually fly a rocket made of ASCII characters up the screen over and over and over again.
Oh, that's cool.
Just looping. So at 10 years old, that was just the most awesome thing in the world was, I can make this thing fly up the screen. It's so impressive. And you think back and like, wow, that was kind of pathetic maybe, but at 10, it was really, really cool. And it kind of got my imagination going, on programming.
Because when you, at least for me, when I started, the idea that I could create something was what drew me there. It was this idea that that it was this blank slate, and I didn't really have artistic ability or these other things to sort of create in that sense.
Right.
But I could make it do things I wanted to. There was something that was very empowering. I guess I was 12 or 13 at the time.
Well, and it's control.
Yeah.
Right. And, my family would be the first to say I can sometimes be a bit of a control freak, which makes me perfect for being a programmer, right? Hey, I can tell this thing what to do and it does it. And sometimes I can tell it the wrong thing to do and it still does it, which can be problematic. But, so later on, I got a Commodore 64 was my first computer.
Oh, nice.
And, I actually mostly enjoyed that for games because in addition to being, a computer, you could also plug cartridges in it and play games on it, like Lunar Lander was one of my favorites. So I didn't really go much further than that, other than I think I can stake the claim, dubious though it may be, of being a professional programmer at the age of 10.
Oh, wow.
Because there was a small teacher's shop that I used to go past on my way home from school, and they had a Commodore PET that they had on display. And me and a buddy would go in. And of course, one of the things that we had to do was we would load some of the kind of commercial at the time games off of cassette. And then while the code was in memory, we'd hack it to say really silly things. Because of course, when you're 10, that's the funniest thing in the world is to change a game to say, thankfully we weren't terribly foul mouthed at the time, so we didn't do cuss words or anything, but we just thought it was the funniest thing in the world to change the code. And that was, one way of learning how these things worked is, okay, if I look in the code, I can see this is where this message is coming from this game that we're playing, and I can change that. And I can actually modify that and make it work the way that I want and run that program again and sort of, ancient line basic debugging, if you will.
So basically how most programmers use Google today.
Exactly. But this teacher shop, I would write kind of little demonstration programs or kind of show people how the computer worked. And they would give me little pencil toppers and other, inexpensive things to kind of pay me for my time. So I was a bartered professional programmer at the age of 10, which was...
That's awesome. That's really awesome. And so you said you didn't do a lot of programming after that in sort of your formative years?
Yeah. So in my teens, I think I was more fascinated with the technology from the standpoint of, getting better and better games, right?
Sure.
So I, of course, had to have the ColecoVision because I was a big Nintendo fan, and it was the only place that you could have a home version of Donkey Kong, which was really important. But it wasn't until actually considerably later that I got back into doing programming.
When you went to college or
No,
before?
In college, I studied music and theater in college.
Oh, wow.
So
I could see that actually knowing you.
So I was actually a theater geek, and I was on the 5-year plan, right? Because of course, it's like, okay, I have a music major. I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life because I was a voice major too. I was a singer. And so I thought, well, I can't see going out and auditioning. I just don't really have the confidence for that. Performing just doesn't seem like the path for me. So you know what? I've done a fair amount of theater. I could do another year at school and get another major, and then maybe that would be the way to go.
And that way, if music didn't work out, you could fall back on the money making of theater.
Precisely. You're exactly right. So I left. I went to school in St. Mary's County, which is a little bit south of here in D.C. And so I actually spent some time doing summer stock theater, and through that got to know a number of people who worked professionally in the D.C. area in theater. And so when I graduated and the panic moment came of, okay, how am I going to make money? Well, I knew some people in D.C. in theater, and I made some calls, and I got some jobs.
Wow.
And so I spent about 6 years after college doing technical theater. So I did everything from building scenery, hanging lights, doing sound design. I worked at pretty much most of the major theaters in the D.C. area, Arena Stage, the Shakespeare Theater, a lot of different theaters around the area. And interestingly enough, in some ways that prepared me for a career in programming, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the kind of common thread was wherever I was, I tended to be the guy who, if a computer broke, I'd be the one who'd be willing to open it up and see if I could figure out what was wrong. Right? And so there were some places where it was just as simple as, okay, the printer's jammed. Somebody call Andrew, right? And I'd come and fix it. And I usually had pretty good luck fixing stuff. So I had the confidence that kind of built up from that of I was the go-to guy. And that culminated in one of the last places that I worked in the theater. They had a bunch of computers and they had licenses for NetWare, but nobody had any idea how to set up a network. And so I ended up kind of reading the instruction manuals and kind of setting things up. And, I thought at that point, well, maybe I should be a network administrator.
Sure.
And it was at that time that I started to think, this theater stuff, not really very lucrative.
Really? That surprises me.
Yeah, I worked, so 6 years I worked in theater, and the most I think I ever made was about $20,000. And I worked at a shop that did television scenery. So there was actually a period of time when I could go anywhere in the country and go into a bar and point to the screen. If ESPN Sports Center was on, I could say, you see that desk? I built that. So the shop that I worked for built a lot of scenery for ESPN. And so that was my claim. That was my 15 minutes of fame for that period of time. But I realized that if I wanted to kind of do the American dream thing and have a family and have a house and, you know, kind of have a life, I was going to need to make some different decisions about my career.
Or marry rich.
Or marry rich, which given my luck in my love life to that date, I didn't think was very likely. So wasn't holding my breath for that one. So I talked to a relative who had his own software development business, and we talked for probably an hour and a half, and he said, you know, Andrew, you already know a lot about computers. What you need is a way to show people how that you know stuff.
Yeah.
And he said, what I'd recommend is get some certifications. And so I thought, okay. So I went out, and this is going to tell you people how old I am. I went out and got certified in Windows 95. Right? Anybody remember Windows 95? And
I remember being certifiable about Windows 95, but never certified.
So I got certified in that, and then I went and got a job at the State Department on the help desk.
Oh, wow.
Which I think I'll skip those stories because they'd probably get me in trouble.
Probably.
Lasted all of 2 weeks at that job, and got another job doing Windows 95 training at the Pentagon. And I remember to this day, the first job was through a staffing company, and the guy that I was working with said, well, Andrew, you know, you're really early in your career. You probably don't want to be burning bridges like this. Now, here's the kicker. The first job at the help desk at the State Department was $12 an hour. The training gig was $25 an hour. Anybody, show of hands, anybody not going to make that decision that I made and burn that particular bridge for double the pay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know,
and especially going to the Pentagon and teaching them how to launch solitaire.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, and that's the funny thing is, of course, I get this training gig, and I think I maybe trained one or two people a week.
Oh, wow.
And then theoretically, I was supposed to be on the help desk there, but they never assigned me any help desk tickets because I was that Windows 95 trainer guy. And so my answer to that was to start learning programming.
Nice.
And I thought, well, I know a little bit about BASIC. Let me look at Visual Basic. And I jumped in and started learning Visual Basic 3. Back in the day, long time ago, Visual Basic 3. And right after that came VB4. And so I decided, well, I'm gonna learn VB4, and that was where COM actually came into the picture.
Yeah.
In Visual Basic.
And 32 bits.
Yeah, and that was a big step ahead too. And so I started really getting into programming by building things that I thought were interesting. So I was at the time dating the woman who is now my wife, and so one of the first applications that I built in Visual Basic 4 was I made an application that would launch hundreds of hearts all over the screen and put it on my now wife's computer for Valentine's Day, so that on Valentine's Day when she booted up her computer, it would just automatically launch and start and throw hearts all over the screen. And
I don't know if that's adorable or pathetic, but I'm voting for both.
Well, you know, she married me, so I'm thinking it was probably a good move on my part. It worked out for me. And then I also was at the time really kind of interested in MIDI files and decided to build a MIDI jukebox.
Nice.
So just basically an application that I could load up a whole directory of MIDI files and just play them one after the other.
Nice.
And so, you know, at the time, life was much simpler then as a programmer.
Seemed to have been.
You know, so again, we didn't have, we didn't have Google, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have all this stuff. We had documentation, and then you had to have an idea that you were kind of passionate about.
Did you have a CompuServe account?
I actually had an AOL account. I was never on CompuServe, so yeah.
That was the magic place for me.
True.
First time I ever talked to other developers was through CompuServe. I never even knew about user groups or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I knew kids when I was in high school who ran BBSs on their trash 80s.
Yeah.
But I was not into the BBS scene. It wasn't really kind of my thing. But yeah, the AOL was the internet for me at the time. It was like that was the internet. It wasn't
I still know people who think that is the internet that still launch AOL even though they've got a wireless connection because they think that's where it starts, and I just don't have the heart or the time. Yeah, exactly. But from there, I was still thinking at the time, well, I'll go the MCSE route. I'll be a systems engineer because there's lots of money to be made there. I knew people at the Pentagon who were contractors and, really good at what they did. And they kind of said, well, you should go down this route. And I took my networking essentials certification, and I did actually pass it. But studying for that exam taught me that I really don't care for calculating IP address ranges and masks, and it's like, okay, yeah, that stuff's just not really my cup of tea. It's a lot of minutia there.
Yeah, and so programming was getting more and more attractive, and there was a Dev Days event that came up in I think 1997. And one of the speakers there, who you've probably met, local guy that a lot of folks here would know, is Jeff Snowman.
Oh, yeah.
And so Jeff was one of, I think they had 4 speakers that day. The rest of the speakers, to be charitable, mostly just kind of read from the slides. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced a talk like that where the speaker just kind of, read what was on the slides and that was it. Jeff actually seemed to know what he was talking about.
Wow.
Right. And he was talking about cross-language development between Visual Basic and C++. It was kind of it's a little bit esoteric for me. I had no clue about C++ at the time. I knew some VB, but I thought this guy really knows what he's talking about. So I'm going to ask him for advice. And so I waited around after the talk and I asked him, I said, here's what I'm doing. I'm new in this industry. I kind of thought about going down the networking route, but I really want to be a professional programmer. What would you recommend? And we chatted for 10 or 15 minutes, and he said, well, what you really want to do is go to work for a Microsoft solution provider, because at the time that was the big thing, is that, if you're a Microsoft solution provider, you got all the resources, you had all the people. He says, as a matter of fact, why don't you send me your resume? Okay. So I sent him a copy of my resume. Didn't hear anything. A couple weeks went by, and I went and I took my VB4 certification.
Nice.
And passed it. And I sent him another copy of my resume. And I guess they must have looked at it and went, well, this guy's kind of ambitious. He's passing a bunch of certs kind of really quickly. And they brought me in for an interview. And the rest, as they say, is history. I got the job. I was actually placed with a couple of it was a small Microsoft shop, about 50 developers. And the job I was put on was building an N-tier application using ASP, classic ASP on the front end, VB-COM components in the middle tier, SQL Server backend. So N-tier, basically when N-tier was just starting.
Yeah.
And I was placed with 2 of the top developers in the company. And so it was really, I could not have asked for better fortune in terms of a learning opportunity to dive in and really kind of get my feet wet with the newest architectural style at the time, and with technologies that were really just beginning to blossom. I mean, that was a time when ASP was really coming into its own as a development platform, and we were still ahead of the dot-com crash.
Yes.
There was we were still well ahead of Y2K. And so it was really just it was very good fortune. And
so did you feel, with that sort of architecture, did you feel like you were in over your head at first?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some of it was just literally across the room from me was one of the developers, and I would just ping him with questions, over and over and over again, and ask him to look at my code and ask him to, and da-da-da. But the first couple of things that I wrote, were page after page after page after page of code in a single method. I mean, it was awful.
Wait, is that a bad idea?
Code. Yes,
is that
terrible,
a bad idea?
Terrible bad idea. Terrible bad idea.
I should not have put that up on GitHub. I guess
if I had to go back, if I had to put that code on GitHub, I would never have been hired for anything ever again. I mean, it was terrible code. But gradually, with working with good developers and kind of asking questions, I started to pick up. Okay, maybe work on having each of these methods do one distinct thing and kind of bringing them together in your code rather than doing everything in main.
Well, it sounds like this is kind of a subject I'm passionate about, but it sounds like you got into this environment where there was a lot to learn. You could be a sponge, but also you weren't afraid of them finding out your level of skill. I mean, the idea that you would go to these guys, show them your code and all that. I think we all know developers that are sort of like, no, I know what I'm doing, even though they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And you didn't seem to have that in the beginning.
Well, one of the advantages that I had going in at that time is that I didn't really know what I didn't know, right? And so when you're young and you're kind of enthusiastic and you're into it and you're kind of geeking out on the code, I mean, I was just feeling lucky that somebody's paying me to do this, right? This is fun. I'm enjoying it. I'm learning and I'm getting paid. How awesome is that? And the difference, I look at how I am today versus how I was then. The difference today is I know all the stuff that I don't know.
Yeah.
I know how much I don't know. And the reality is that I know orders of magnitude more stuff than I knew when I was in my 20s and getting my start as a professional programmer. But the fact that I know how much I don't know makes a lot of it that much more intimidating.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I do.
And it's, so the next new JavaScript framework comes out and you feel like, I should know that. But there's not enough hours in the day for me to know that and this and the other thing at any level of depth.
Yeah.
And so I try to keep a finger on the pulse of the industry in terms of what's going on. And then you just kind of have to pick and choose either, okay, somebody's paying me to work with this technology, so now I can go dive deep on it and figure it out.
Yeah.
Or, each of us has to kind of pick out, okay, there are certain things that I'm going to go deep on, even if it takes some of my own time.
Yeah.
But you can't do all of them. And the difference between now and then is when I was getting started with Classic ASP, you could know every single API of Classic ASP. Right? Because there were, 5 intrinsic objects,
yes,
which had maybe a dozen each method calls on them or properties.
80% of the API was file system object, right? Everything else was pretty simple.
So it really, you could know all of Classic ASP. You could really know it at that level of depth. And even the initial releases of ASP.NET, you could know by heart the vast majority of the API space of that product. You can't do that anymore.
No.
You can't know all of MVC. You can't know all. I mean, yeah, I suppose you could if you really, really niche down on just that. But we have to know the server side pieces. We have to know enough about the client side pieces to not create incredible havoc when we need to touch them. There's so much to know. It's a very different world today.
It is. It is.
Which is not to say it's, better or worse. I mean, I don't want to go back to Classic ASP, quite frankly.
Oh, come on.
It had the advantage of simplicity, but at the same time, you were pretty limited in terms of what you could build with it. Or to the extent that you weren't limited, you were limited in the sense that anything that wasn't already there, you had to write.
Yeah.
And it had its rough edges.
Yes, absolutely.
Now and again. How many people had to write scripts that they could automatically bounce IAS because memory was going through the stratosphere.
Until IAS figured out that they'll do that for you.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Everybody's writing scripts to restart the web server. Let's just build that in,
Yes.
We'll restart every 60 minutes.
So you started this job and you were, this sponge for whatever you could learn. Mm-hmm. There had to have been a point where that sort of pivot, and then suddenly you were able to be a mentor to other people, much like these guys were a mentor to you. What was that like?
So some of that was again, I mean, I liken it to, and forgive me for folks who aren't religious, but I liken it to God opening doors at the right time for me. And sometimes it was a matter of me not knowing better than to step through. So I actually, within the first couple of years of starting at that job, I was looking. So one of the things that I love doing is just reading. So I read Professional ASP 3.0, the one that was about 4 inches thick, mm-hmm. cover to cover. Wow. And I did that because I was commuting from Arlington in the DC suburbs to downtown DC, and I would get on a bus, and then I'd take the bus to the subway, and I'd take the subway into downtown. And so I had lots of time when, I wasn't driving, so I didn't have to worry about, paying attention to the road. So I'd sit on the bus and on the subway to and from work, reading through this book, cover to cover. So again, kind of sponge-like.
Yeah.
And eventually I looked at it and I thought, well, Rox does these books where they've got every chapter written by a different author. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could find a book where I could jump in and write a chapter.
Yeah.
Just
very approachable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's not kind of biting off more than you chew. It's just sort of, okay, I could pick a topic, go deeper on it, and write about it. Well, it didn't work out that way. So one of my coworkers at the job I was working on had contact information from somebody from what was a now defunct publishing company called Ventana, mm-hmm. And the guy that he had met had kind of stepped out and done his own publishing house, like a boutique publishing house, and he also did representation. So I emailed the guy and I say, "Do you have any projects going on where you could use an author, just for a chapter?" And he responded and said, "No, I don't have anything like that, but why don't we talk about what you'd like to write about, and maybe we can put together a proposal."
Right.
So one thing led to another, and I ended up doing a book proposal for an enterprise level book on Visual InterDev 6 development. So we looked.
Does anyone remember Visual InterDev?
Right? Yeah.
Does anyone remember it fondly? Okay.
So for those of you who don't remember Visual InterDev was effectively a drag and drop tool for building classic ASP applications. So Visual InterDev was sort of what web forms ended up being better at. Visual InterDev allowed you to take and drag controls onto a page, and it would write literally thousands of lines of script behind the scenes for you on the server side, and some of it on the client side. And it was enormously heavyweight. And at the time, of course, I thought, well, this would be really cool if these were COM components.
Right. Which
is not quite what ASP.NET did.
Right.
But very similar. So we ended up there eventually. But Visual InterDev was a tool where at the time that we were putting this together, it was a 1.0 release. The second release was 6.0, which is just how Microsoft names things.
Yeah, that seems normal.
And so we looked at kind of the market of books that were out there and thought, well, nobody's really writing enterprise grade books on Visual InterDev. That's probably a nice niche.
Sure.
And he happened to have some contacts at Microsoft Press, and he said, well, let's send this over to them and see what they think. And I think weeks went by, and we just thought, well, they're not interested, so let's move on to the next publisher. And we started, putting out feelers to other publishers, and Microsoft Press comes back and says, yeah, let's write this book. At which point, of course, what? I have to write a book?
A whole book.
Here, my thought process was this, right? Let's do a proposal. Okay, this is a learning opportunity. I can learn how to write a book proposal. It never occurred to me when I agreed to do the proposal that someone might say yes.
So you were on the hook for a lot of work.
Yeah, and I'd never written a book before So I had no idea how much work I had just signed up for, right? Writing a book is hard.
Very hard.
So I ended up, I thought, well, there's a lot of this stuff, because I'd written an outline and everything, I had kind of a lot of it thought out of what should be in here. And I went to 4 of my coworkers who were domain experts in specific parts of what I wanted to talk about and said, how would you like to write a chapter in this book? And so that's how I ended up covering things that I was just in no position experience-wise to cover.
Sure.
And that's how I ended up writing my first book, which came out, I think, in 1998 or so.
Wow.
Either 98 or 99. And once having done that, that ends up being kind of the invitation into a whole nother world, right? So speaking became very easy to do. I would get I got invited actually out to Redmond for an author summit where they talked about what would eventually become .NET, but which at the time was, you remember?
Cool.
Com Plus.
Oh yeah, Com Plus.
And Next Generation Web Services, aka NIGWS, which was a terrible, terrible name, and I'm so glad we ended up with .NET. But I actually had, and ASP.NET was called ASP Plus, and I actually still have, to this day, I had actually signed up for asplusguy@hotmail.com as an email address because I had this idea that I was going to have a website, Ask the ASP Plus Guy, and then they changed the name on me, and I kind of went, ASP.NET guy just doesn't have the same ring to it. So
I had 2/3 of my ADO.NET. I'm sorry, my ADO Plus book done when they announced the change, and I was like. And I promised myself I would never write on a beta product ever again. And if any of you know me, I think that's all I do. I think that's all I do.
Well, and funny you should say, because my second book was actually on ASP.NET 1.0.
Right.
So I did the ASP.NET step-by-step for Microsoft Press. And when ASP.NET was just about to be released, they had actually made a major change in the security settings for ASP.NET. Originally, with the original version of ASP.NET, all of your code ran as system.
Right.
Right. And so that was actually really beautiful for an author because you didn't have to worry about setting up anything for your SQL Server code, right? If your SQL Server was local, you were essentially running as SA, right? It was really easy to get that going. You didn't have to teach people anything about SQL Server security. Well, they changed that so that it was using, I think they hadn't changed it to network service yet. They had some interim ASP.NET account that they set up that was a lower privileged account. And we were literally just putting the finishing touches on the book. And I had somebody who I knew from locally who was at Microsoft in Redmond, and he emailed me and said, you need to know this change is coming down and it's going to come out with the next release. And I said, but that's going to break all of my SQL Server examples. And he said, yeah, probably will. And so I had to go back to Microsoft Press and said, we have to change all of our SQL examples to make sure that people set things up correctly, because otherwise every single data access example in the entire book will be wrong out of the gate. And they said, yeah, we should probably fix that. So
that was a good decision by them.
I was thankful to have that happen before we actually hit the shelves, because that would have been unfortunate.
So I knew you as the DE, I guess was the role then.
Right.
Here in DC. The DE and DC, I didn't mean for those to be so close together. But how did that happen? Because you were here for, I think you were the second longest DE in the country, right?
Right. Yeah. So I started at Microsoft in 2004, summer of 2004. And the way that I actually got the job, and again, it's, sort of one thing tends to lead to another.
Yeah.
I mean, had I not gone through the process of writing books and stuff, I don't know that I would have ever ended up here. But I was speaking quite frequently in those days, and I had had signed up for a talk at another Dev Days event here in the DC area, and I finished up my talk and I was heading back to the elevator, and a guy named Justin, who was the DE at the time, stopped me as I was heading to the elevator and said, would you be interested in being considered for this position? And he told me about the position, and he told me about the evangelist role. And it struck me as being the kind of role where I could do exactly what I had been doing, which is talking about Microsoft technologies that I was excited about, teaching people, writing about technology, only where all of those things were things that I was kind of doing for free in my free time. I'd actually get paid to do that. Okay, twist my arm. So
you didn't know you were going to have to keep the elevators open during events?
Yeah, well, there were some aspects of it that were less fun than others, but for a good long period of time, it really was. It was the best job in the company. I got to have a lot of fun teaching people about technologies. I got to play with all the new bits when they came out.
Yeah.
Sometimes that felt a little bit like chasing on a hamster wheel, every new set of bits that come out. Now, when I started in 2004, we didn't just download the bits from the internet. We would actually have to go through VPN to the Redmond servers and download virtual machines to run all this stuff, because trying to set it up with some of the preview bits was just way too hard to do.
Yeah.
Now, we get the preview bits multiple times. We can pull the code off GitHub. I mean, it's like
it's a whole different world.
Should we call this the Get Off My Lawn podcast? Maybe, I don't know.
I did consider it. I did consider it. I think it was my fourth podcast. I spent a long time explaining what a cassette tape was. So yeah. There's absolutely a bit of that.
Yeah. So again, working for Microsoft was great fun. I had a period in between where I actually went independent on my own.
Oh, nice.
And I found out the hard way that at the time I was really good at getting conference gigs and writing articles and things like that. I was a terrible independent consultant because I was awful at the business development side of things. It was just not really my strong suit.
Sure.
So,
which is why when you left Microsoft you became independent again?
Well, I figured second time's the charm, maybe. Maybe I'll have to wait for the third time. I don't know. But I figured after having been at one job for almost 10 years, I just wasn't ready to do another full-time, go be an employee. And I figured I'd probably built up at least a little bit more of a network to work with. And, so far it's worked out okay.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing the podcast. This is wonderful. I never knew about your theater background, but after, we've known each other, I don't know, 10, 12 years, now it doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah. That doesn't surprise me at all. You sort of give off that vibe.
Yeah.
In a good way. In a good way.
Cool.
Well, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can subscribe